Welcome to Matt's Nerd Network. With 24 movies and 3 TV shows under their belt, the MCU has built quite the plethora of villains. Some hits, but also a lot of misses. I thought it was a good time to talk about 5 that I think are the best and the 5 that I think are the worst. And if you disagree with me, feel free to leave it in the comments down below. Let's have a discussion. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. The number 5 worst is gonna be Yon-Rogg. Now I'll be honest, I initially was planning on putting Ronan in this spot, but I actually feel like there's some interesting things about Ronan being some kind of crazy religious zealot. Could be actually something really interesting, it was just executed kind of poorly. The reason Yon-Rogg just barely beat out Ronan is that I think he's the most forgettable villain in the entire MCU. And what I mean by that is that he was the only villain when I was making this video that I could not remember the name of until I made the video. It's not like Jude Law is giving a bad performance or the character is overly uninteresting. It's just that he's super forgettable. Like I said, he's the only villain that I forgot about, which is why he made his way to the number 5 spot of the worst. The number 5 best is one that I kind of juggled around for a while. I went back and forth from a couple people, but ultimately I think that the number 5 best is Obadiah Stane from the original Iron Man. I personally think that this character was totally underutilized and should have been in more movies. I think that he laid the foundation for what we see in a lot of Marvel movies, which is the villain being just basically the same as the hero, but the opposite. I think in terms of Iron Man's case, that was the perfect villain that he needed in that movie, a movie where his villain is kind of the person that he would have became if he had never became good, and I think that's really interesting. Also, Jeff Bridges is always great. I really want to see this character again. Now that we're doing all multiverse stuff, it would be really great to see Obadiah Stane again, to see the Ironmonger again. I really enjoyed this villain, and I'm disappointed we didn't get more of him. Even Jeff Bridges didn't think that his character was going to be killed off at the end, because he apparently signed a 3-movie contract, which means that maybe we will see him again. Who knows? I don't know. I don't think that we will, but I would be nice to see him again. But with the fact that they're bringing back characters like Abomination from the Incredible Hulk, I think that anything could happen, so I do hope we see him again. The number 4 worst for me has to be Whiplash. For some reason, I just really don't like Whiplash. I don't think that Mickey Rourke casting as Whiplash was very good. I don't think that the character was all that great. He was just kind of what we saw with Obadiah Stane, but done again and worse. And he was way overshadowed by Justin Hammer, who was a much more fun to watch and interesting villain. I don't know, for some reason I really just don't like Whiplash. It's not like he did anything particularly egregious. He's just forgettable and kind of bad, to me at least. The character itself had an interesting idea, being, instead of the sins of Tony Stark's past, like most Iron Man movies delve into, it was the sins of the father, which is pretty interesting. I don't know, it just kind of got muddled in all the many storylines that were being thrown into Iron Man 2, and it just didn't really work for me. But he does have the iconic line,
I want my bird.
A bird? You want a bird?
I want my bird.
Maybe that makes him the best villain, because that's the most iconic line in the entire MCU. This one's gonna be controversially low, but I thought about it for a while, and I like the next villain just a little bit more than this one, and that's gonna be Killmonger. Now, don't get me wrong, Killmonger is an absolutely amazing villain, and he is obviously one of the best in the MCU, top 4, obviously, but I just don't feel that we had enough of him. He has one of the best motivations in all of the MCU, but he's not even in half of Black Panther. There's so much of that movie that is just Ulysses Claw, which is great because I love that villain as well, but we just didn't get a lot of Killmonger. He's one of the best at being a grounded person that you understand and makes sense, and also kind of beats out the hero in terms of his motivation. Like, we're on his side more than we're on even Black Panther's side at points, which makes him so great. Don't get me wrong, me putting him at number 4 is not me saying that he's not an amazing villain. He has some of the most iconic lines in the MCU, but I just like the next villain on the list a little bit more. I absolutely love Killmonger, and he absolutely deserves all the praise that he gets. The number 3 worst for me is gonna be Malekith. Now, a lot of people think that this is the worst villain, and I don't think that, obviously, but I do think that he's just kind of a big pile of nothing. He's just kind of there. He doesn't really have many lines. He doesn't really have much to do. He's just kind of the bad guy that wants to do bad things because of bad reasons. And that makes him pretty mute and forgettable, but at least he's like kind of intimidating, you know? He has a pretty cool army, and I enjoyed Curse in Thor the Dark World, and I also kind of think Thor the Dark World is kind of underrated in general, but Malekith is ultimately super forgettable and just the worst thing that a Marvel villain can be, which is just boring. The number 3 best for me is gonna be Vulture. I think they did a fantastic job with this villain. Out of all the villains in the MCU, I don't think there's a single villain that's more a real person, which is why he just slightly beats out Killmonger, because he's just so real and visceral. I think the scene where he is Liz's dad is one of the best twists in the entire MCU, and very few times in the MCU am I genuinely surprised. That genuinely surprised me. It's also just one of the best scenes in the entire MCU. So is the car ride that follows after that. Michael Keaton does an amazing job, and we're seeing him again, which I'm super happy about. We see at the end of Spider-Man Homecoming in the post-credit scene that he has a code. He's not like a bad guy. He's just a guy that was in very poor circumstances. He's just one of the most relatable villains a villain can be, because he's just been stomped on by the man and just wants to create a good life for his family. Everything about this character was well set up, well developed. The best Spider-Man villains are the ones that are the like real true people. Those are the best Spider-Man villains, and he truly is one of the best Spider-Man villains that we've ever seen on screen. The number 2 worst is going to be Taskmaster. Now, to be honest, Taskmaster is the reason I wanted to make this video. I'm going to be spoiling Black Widow because I kind of need to go into why I think this character is such a disappointment. Taskmaster is one of my favorite villains from the comics. Literally the only thing that makes this Taskmaster is that somebody calls her Taskmaster at one point, and it's like Taskmaster in the movie doesn't even like really master tasks, other than like a couple times where she like copies some of Black Widow's movements and like references to other movies. But other than that, it's really not Taskmaster. It's just some silent like G.I. Joe Snake Eyes ripoff for most of the movie. Like, that's what you're getting, is just like a silent assassin. The only reason that this is Taskmaster is because the studio had a mandate to put Taskmaster in this film. Literally, when the writers are talking about it, they're like, we had to have Taskmaster in this movie, but we didn't know how to make Taskmaster work, so we just made it into this other character we had. It's not Taskmaster. It's just an assassin who vaguely resembles Taskmaster. Doesn't even really resemble Taskmaster. When it comes to Taskmaster, you really only need to get 2 things right. You need to have a skull mask and a white hood. They couldn't even like come close. Yeah, it has a white hood that he never wears, and I guess like it kind of has like a little part of its mask that resembles a skull. It just doesn't even look like Taskmaster. Other than like the little tiny bit of the mask that looks like the skull, this could be a completely different character. You knew it was bad when the trailer showed Taskmaster, and everybody was saying that Taskmaster looked like a Power Ranger villain, and I agreed. But man, I was really hoping for more. I was really hoping for it to be better, and the actress says that she wants to return, and like, I'm never gonna root for an actor to not have work, but I think if they bring this character back, they need to change it up a little bit, because I just don't think it works. The number 2 best MCU villain for me, and this is going to be a lot of people's number 1, and that's gonna be Thanos. Now, in terms of Infinity War, he was everything that he needed to be, especially in that movie. He was like the main character. He lived up to an impossible expectation through basically one movie of building him as a character, which is just why I think Infinity War is such a great film. He was played amazingly by Josh Brolin. He has so much subtlety and nuance. It's usually impossible for a character that's completely CGI to be related to, but they did an amazing job with Thanos. He has respect and he has a mission and a goal. That's what makes him so terrifying, is just how motivated his ambition is. Like, it's crazy. I think one of the things that prevents him from being the best villain in the MCU is just that a lot of that nuance and subtlety and understandability was taken out of his character in Endgame, where he just became more of kind of a guy that just wanted to destroy everything, and that's a little bit disappointing, but I still think that this character is not only one of the best villains in the MCU, but one of the best characters in the MCU. And finally, for the worst villain, the absolute behemoth of badness, in my opinion, in all of the MCU, is gonna be Aldrich Killian. Now, this is not me saying that I think that the Mandarin twist was just the worst thing, because I don't. I think it's kind of funny. Ben Kingsley playing Trevor Slattery. I think that's a fun little twist, and I think it's funny. However, when you take a potentially amazing and intimidating villain and you change that, like if I saw this guy, I would not be afraid of him. I mean, I'd probably be afraid if he started breathing fire, but I wouldn't be afraid of just him by himself. He's just some douchey business looking guy. He's the one villain in all the MCU that's just like, I don't buy you. You're just a weasel man. I don't buy you as being the main bad guy. And when you have a really cool setup for a potentially like amazing villain, and then you switch to somebody that's just this, it just doesn't work for me. Like, I think the twist is actually a really smart twist to play off of people's perception of who they think would be a terrorist in order to cover up these people exploding. It's kind of brilliant. It's just the idea that you take somebody who's really intimidating and you turn them into this. And honestly, it's the one thing that kind of ruins Iron Man 3 for me. It's not the twist. I think the twist is fine. It's the fact that I don't find him intimidating at all. He's just a yelling weasel guy, and I don't think he works at all.
I am the Mandarin!
Before we get to the number one villain, there's a few villains I want to say for honorable mentions here. I want to talk about some villains that I didn't put on this list because we just haven't seen enough of them. Mainly Zemo. For one thing, I think he was kind of underdeveloped in Civil War, and then in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, he was actually technically a protagonist, and I think he was a really fun character, and I think he has the potential to be a top 5 villain for sure. But we just haven't seen enough of him, so I can't wait to see more of him, wherever that may be. I'm obviously not going to put Kang on this list because we haven't really actually even seen Kang. We saw a variant of Kang, which wasn't even really Kang. He may very well end up being a top 5 villain. Marvel has lately been hitting it out of the park. I think they really killed it with Mysterio and all the TV show villains like Agatha Harkness, and I think Carly was actually really well done. There's also some others like Claw that I mentioned, and Justin Hammer that I mentioned, and also one of the ones that nobody talks about that I think is super under talked about as a villain, and it's literally just because he doesn't have any like superpowers or abilities, is Alexander Pierce, who I think is one of the best, most realistic villains in all of the MCU. He's one of the ones that barely missed my top 5 because I really think that he's underrated. And go watch Captain America: The Winter Soldier. I'm gonna tell everybody to watch that at all times because I think it's one of the best movies ever, and I think it deserves to be watched. And finally, the number one spot, the best villain in the MCU, in my opinion, is going to be Loki. Now, I doubt anyone's surprised by this. He's most people's favorite villain. But man, did I like Loki from the get-go. From the very first Thor, I thought Loki was amazing. He's always been one of my favorite characters. He was one of the best villains, if not the best villain, in just Thor alone. He wasn't trying to be the ruler of anything. He just wanted what Thor had, like a true family that considers him an equal, and that's his motivation for everything he does throughout the entire MCU. Through all the characters and all the different directors directing all these different movies, Loki is one of the characters that has had probably the most stable arc in the MCU, even through Thor Ragnarok, which has a completely different tone from the other Thors. Loki's character development stays the same, and he slowly goes from being, the big bad in the Avengers to being a character that is a good person that we all like from Thor: The Dark World and Thor Ragnarok, just in those 2 movies. And I'm happy that we got more of him because I think he's great, and I think that he's great in the Loki series, and the Loki series is great, and just everything about Loki is great. He's always had one of the best arcs, and he deserves all the hype. So I'm glad he got his own series, and I'm glad people like it so much, and I'm glad people are are loving Loki as much as they are, because it's great to see. So yeah, Loki's my favorite villain, obviously, and I can't wait to see more of him. Thanks so much for watching the video, guys. I really appreciate it. If you made it this far, you might as well like and subscribe, and comment below your top 5 and your bottom 5 villains. I'm genuinely curious. I love the discussion, so if you disagree with me, call me out. Have a great one. Goodbye.